ultimate ways to control and own the country. Under something called the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, Congress actually gave 174 million acres of public land to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads, which were sections of land that stretched for miles. And then something really interesting happened. Union Pacific insiders set up something called the Credit Mobilier Construction Company, and they quietly gave out discounted or even free shares of this company to key congressmen and people in power to make sure that in return, they would get friendly legislation and funding. And when all of this broke out in 1872, it exposed how land grants could actually influence politics and give total corporate control of new territories. Now fast forward to today, and a small group of mega-landlords still control disproportionate amounts of power over local economies and politics. Private owners, for example, control 1.3 billion acres, or about 60% of US land. Now some of those families are maybe names you've never heard of, like the Emerson family, which control over 2.4 million acres, or John Malone at over 2.2 million acres. Even tech CEOs like Bill Gates have bought up over 200,000 acres of farmland across 18 states. In Nebraska alone, for example, his Mount Edna Farms LLC now controls over 20,000 acres. And people are starting to get worried because if any of it went tax exempt and became a nonprofit, then that would mean all the counties that are around it could see their property tax revenues destroyed. And that could negatively affect schools and services and everything else. So whoever owns land still holds a huge amount of power. They can control who gets tax money, voting districts, and which resources go where. So that's the first aspect of who owns and controls America. Those who control a lot of land. Now, if land was the original source of power, then credit was the evolution of it. And it still hugely owns not just the US, but the entire world. And the origin story of how credit came to be is gonna sound like a total conspiracy, but it's not. In November 1910, a secret group of US bankers led by JP Morgan, National City, the First National Bank of New York, and a few other big banks under Senator Aldrich's sponsorship. They all met here, in a place called Jekyll Island. Their goal was to create the Federal Reserve Act in order to control the supply of America's money. Permit me to issue and control the money of a nation, and I care not who makes its laws. Now that was a very famous quote that is oftentimes attributed to Mayor Amschel Rothschild. Now, the Rothschild family built the blueprint of central banking in the 1800s, but when it came to America's actual money printer, the family, despite all the endless conspiracy theories, supposedly never held direct ownership over the Fed. Instead, the Fed is owned by the smaller commercial US banks. And when Congress passed the act in December 1913, it created the 12 regional reserve banks. And all of them were given the superpower to do what's called fractional reserve banking. And that allows the banks to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and lend the rest of it to someone else. Now, this is gonna blow your mind, but here is how it used to work up until very recently. Let's say you deposit $100 with your bank. Now that bank can loan up to $90 of your money to someone else. The other $10 is reserved for you in case you need it. That's called vault cash. Now your bank account will still show you having $100, but on the bank side though, that $100 deposit just created another $90 for the bank to lend out. Now let's say someone borrows that $90 of technically your money, and then they pay someone for something that they bought. Then that person goes to deposit their $90 with their bank, and that bank also gets to do the exact same thing and lend out 90% of it. And this process can repeat until there's up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by only $100 of vault cash. Now, believe it or not, that's how it used to work. But as of March 2020, that system changed. And now the Fed has lowered the reserve requirement to 0%, meaning there's no reserve requirement for banks. They can lend out the maximum amount of everything you deposit. Of course, under the Fed's guidance. Now today, our central bank the Federal Reserve, has over $6 trillion on their balance sheet. And they also get to control things like the mortgage rates, which is based on the 10-year Treasury bond, corporate credit, and the purchasing power of our paychecks. And to this day, the president does not have control or authority over the Fed, and he cannot fire the person in charge of it. And that's why some people say that if a handful of banks get to decide who creates dollars and how many of them, then that's one way to own a country. Now, if banks control the money, then who controls and owns the US stock market? There's a lot of interesting theories out there, but probably the most popular one is the Holy Trinity: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street.
BlackRock is the subject of a lot of speculation online.
There is a robot that controls more wealth than any country on earth.
Really, the commander-in-chief is Larry Fink.
They have stock in 95% of Fortune 500 companies, and they've been hired by governments across the world to help manage financial crises and even just conduct normal operations.
Imagine if you had control of 88% of CEOs of S&P 500 companies. What kind of influence do you have?
Now, you've probably heard the claims that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, or the big three, own the stock market. And the truth is that this is so wrong and so right at the same time. It's wrong because, yes, they do manage trillions of dollars, but most of that money belongs to everyday investors like you and me. So technically, they're just managing our money, not owning the world outright. But it's true that they do have a huge amount of power and control, so much so that Charlie Munger once famously said, "I think the world of Fink, but I'm not sure I want him to be my emperor." So let me break down why their power is very real and how it actually works. Now, the central bank is not the only thing that can create money into existence. The stock market can also make its own special form of money. You see, public companies can create new shares of their company. For example, a company called MicroStrategy does this all the time. They do that so they could buy more Bitcoin. And by creating new stocks and new money, they can double down and buy more Bitcoin to hopefully make their stock worth even more. But the question is, who gets to decide which companies get to do that? Well, it turns out it's the company itself, the company's own board of directors. And if the dilution's big enough, technically the shareholders as well. But here's where BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street come in to sort of run the show. They can't call up the CEO of strategy and be like, "Hey, Michael, you're fired." But they do vote on who becomes members of the board of a company. And those people can make those decisions. They can vote on director elections, and those people can influence company policy. But they also have another superpower. The big three have a vested interest in almost every company in the S&P 500, with roughly $23 trillion under management and proxy votes on about 90% of US stocks.
The three of them combined are the major stockholders of 95% of American corporations. How's that?
That's not good.
That's power.
And what that means is, when your average mutual fund or ETF like VTSAX from Vanguard needs to vote on something, it turns to one of those three giants to cast your proxy. Now, what's a proxy? A proxy is just the legal permission given to them by you to vote your shares at a company meeting when you can't be there yourself, which is the case for most working people with a job. Now, personally, I don't ever vote on anything. I have the right to, and I get all the letters in the mail. I just don't have the time or interest to. You're probably in the same boat. So instead, Vanguard's stewardship team analyzes those proposals against their policy and gets to vote on your behalf. So even though the big three don't technically own the stock market, their voting power does have a lot of weight and by extension, a lot of power. And that's why some people say, well, if just three asset managers hold the biggest voting blocks in almost every major company in existence, then who really owns corporate America? Now, if banks and corporations can borrow in